The jungle of Veridon was silent but for the distant chirp of insects and the soft rustling of the wind through the leaves. A blanket of thick fog clung to the earth, the perfect cover for Lieutenant Mike Shepard and his spotter, Sarah Hawk Jensen. They had been dropped into this hostile territory under the guise of a simple rescue mission. It should have been routine. No one expected the Vothra Marauders to have a presence on this planet. Mike squatted low, his rifle cradled in his arms. He scanned the horizon with his scope, the crosshairs gliding over the dense forest that stretched for miles. "Clear," he whispered into his comms, his voice calm and measured. The small device tucked into his earpiece transmitted the message directly to Sarah, who was crouched beside him, her eyes scanning the terrain through her own binoculars. "We've got civilians inside the compound, LT," Sarah murmured. 5, maybe 6. No signs of heavy artillery. But I'll bet they've got something to make our lives hell. Mike grunted in response, his fingers moving over the controls of his rifle with practiced ease. His eyes locked onto a distant tower, barely visible through the layers of fog. It was the kind of place the Marauders would set up shop, high ground, overlooking everything. A perfect vantage point. "That's where they'll be," he said, more to himself than Sarah. "We get to them before they know what hit them." They were in position. The Marauder stronghold was within striking distance, the civilians confined in a large warehouse-like structure at the center of the compound. Their team was supposed to strike quickly, neutralize any threats, and get the civilians out without a hitch. But Mike knew that nothing went according to plan. Not in this line of work. "Move on your mark," Mike whispered. Sarah nodded, adjusting the comm unit and signaling to the rest of their team. Without a word, they began their descent down the incline, stepping through the dense foliage with practiced precision. Every step calculated, every movement deliberate. The last thing they wanted was to be noticed. They hadn't gone far when Mike froze, his hand shooting up in a silent command. Sarah halted immediately beside him, her eyes sharp. Mike's keen instincts had picked up the faintest rustle in the trees ahead. A shadow moved, too fast to be anything but a person. And not just any person, Vothra Marauders. "Trap," Mike muttered under his breath. The words felt like a death sentence. Sarah's eyes narrowed. She looked ahead, her hand resting on her sidearm. "You're not telling me." "They're waiting for us," Mike finished for her, his voice a low growl. "They know we're here. They've had time to set up an ambush." The trees around them seemed to close in as the realization hit. They were outgunned and surrounded. There was no way they were getting out of this without a fight. Without warning, the air erupted with the sound of gunfire. Sarah ducked instinctively, pulling Mike behind the nearest cover, a thick cluster of overgrown ferns. Bullets whizzed by, cutting through the vegetation with frightening precision. The Vothra Marauders had found them. They were already in position. "Move!" Mike shouted, pulling Sarah to her feet. They dashed for cover, zigzagging between trees and rocks. The world seemed to explode around them, the crack of weapons firing and the splintering of bark filling the air. Mike's mind raced as he calculated the angle of attack, the best route for an escape, and how to neutralize the Marauders without losing any more ground. "Left flank!" Sarah called out, spotting a Marauder trying to circle around them. Without hesitation, she dropped to one knee and fired, the loud crack of her rifle slicing through the air. The Marauder crumpled to the ground in an instant, but more followed. They moved with ruthless efficiency, taking down Marauder after Marauder as they fought their way deeper into the jungle. The gunfire, once deafening, began to fade as they eliminated the immediate threats. But the real danger was still ahead. The ambush wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Mike scanned the surroundings, his senses heightened. There was something wrong. The sounds of battle had died down too quickly. It was too clean. Too quiet. "They're not fighting back," he said, his voice tinged with suspicion. Sarah glanced around, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about? They were just shooting at us like crazy." "No, they've been expecting us," Mike interrupted. "This whole thing feels off. Like they want us to follow them." And then it hit him. This wasn't just a battle. It was a trap designed to lead them straight into a killing zone. Suddenly, the air around them shifted. A loud crack echoed from behind. Mike spun around just in time to see a net of energy coils snap shut around Sarah, pulling her off her feet. Her startled scream was drowned out by the sound of more marauders emerging from the underbrush, their weapons trained on her. "Sarah!" Mike shouted, his voice raw with panic. Before he could react, one of the marauders raised a fist and pointed it directly at him. "Hold your fire!" the Vothra leader commanded, his voice deep and gravelly. "We have what we want." Mike froze, his rifle trained on the leader's chest. He knew better than to make a rash move. In a situation like this, every decision counted. The marauders advanced, their faces twisted with smug satisfaction. "You thought you were the hunter," the leader sneered. "But now you're the prey." Mike's eyes remained locked on Sarah, who struggled against the coils. He couldn't let them get away with her. But he couldn't risk shooting. If he did, she'd be caught in the crossfire. The marauder leader stepped closer, raising his weapon to Sarah's head. "You'll watch her die, human," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Mike's hand tightened around his rifle, his mind working through the plan as the world seemed to slow down. There was no way out, unless he made one. "Let her go," Mike said, his voice low and controlled. The marauder leader chuckled, the sound grating. "You think you're in control? You're far from it." Then, he took one final step forward, his weapon aimed at Sarah's head. Mike's heart pounded. This was the moment. He could either kill them all, or he could lose Sarah forever. "Release her," Mike repeated, his voice a warning. The marauder leader hesitated, his eyes flicking between Mike and Sarah. The weight of the situation was settling on him, and he was just beginning to realize the one thing the marauders had gotten wrong: they had underestimated who they were dealing with. The next few moments would decide everything. The Vothra marauder leader's weapon hovered inches from Sarah's head. Mike's every muscle tensed as he considered his options. The marauder's smug grin widened as he watched Mike, knowing that the sniper was trapped. For a brief moment, Mike's mind raced, calculating every possibility. "Don't move," the marauder leader hissed, his voice thick with satisfaction. "You're no longer in control here, human." Mike's fingers flexed around his rifle, but he didn't fire. He couldn't. Not yet. If he shot, Sarah would be the first to pay the price. A few meters behind the marauder leader, other Vothra soldiers stood, their weapons trained on Mike. Their yellow eyes glinted with hunger, eager to kill. They were well aware of his reputation, the white feather sniper who had torn through their kind on countless battlefields, but they were also confident now. After all, they had Sarah in their grip. Mike's gaze flicked back to Sarah. She was struggling against the energy net, her face flushed with effort, but her eyes met his with unspoken understanding. She wasn't giving up. Neither was he. "We don't have to do this," Mike said, his voice low but steady, as if he was talking to an old friend instead of a ruthless enemy. "Let her go, and we can work something out." The marauder leader's laughter cut through the air, harsh and grating. "Work something out?" he spat. "I'm not here for negotiations, sniper. I've heard of your legend, the so-called white feather. The perfect marksman. You think I haven't prepared for you?" Mike's jaw clenched. He could feel the tension in the air thickening, pressing against his chest. He had no intention of falling into a trap, but he wasn't going to let Sarah suffer either. His eyes never left her, watching for the slightest sign of a shift, any movement that might give him an opening. The marauder leader's gaze flicked to his soldiers, who stood with their weapons raised, ready to fire at any moment. "I'll say this only once," the leader growled. "You drop your weapon, or I'll put a bullet in her head. Your choice." Mike's mind was still working, calculating, but time was running out. His grip on his sniper rifle tightened, his senses alive with the need to act. There had to be something he could do. "I've killed better men than you," Mike said, his tone cold, deliberate. "If you think for 1 second that your men can stop me, you're gravely mistaken." The marauder leader's eyes narrowed. He'd heard the stories, everyone had. The white feather sniper had taken down entire platoons with a single shot, a deadly force of nature from the human special forces. But the leader was too proud, too confident in his control over the situation. Enough talk, the Marauder leader snapped. Either you surrender or she dies. For a moment, the world stood still. The soldiers around Mike shifted slightly, and the faintest glimmer of light caught the edge of their weapons. Mike's mind worked faster now, analyzing every movement, every sound. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, the faintest twitch of a figure stepping out of the shadows. A flash of movement in the underbrush. Sarah's eyes flicked toward the distraction, but Mike had already processed it. He knew what it meant. A secondary team. Back up. Get ready, Mike muttered, barely audible through his comms. Sarah's eyes flickered with recognition, and she shifted, her body subtly adjusting as she prepared to act. The Marauder leader stepped closer, his breath hot against Sarah's neck. You're finished, he hissed. But the moment the leader's attention diverted to Sarah, Mike made his move. With a smooth, practiced motion, he dropped to one knee, using his rifle as a pivot, and fired. The sound of the shot was deafening in the stillness of the jungle. The bullet sped through the air with deadly precision, striking the leader's weapon, sending it spinning away from his grip. Before the Marauder leader could react, Mike was on his feet, moving with a fluidity that belied the chaos around him. The Marauder soldiers hesitated for only a fraction of a second, just long enough for Mike to take advantage. Another shot rang out, this one piercing the throat of the closest soldier, sending him crumpling to the ground in a spray of dark blood. Chaos erupted. Mike didn't wait. He moved with purpose, darting from one piece of cover to another, his rifle coming up each time he took a shot. His movements were precise, calculated, each shot fired with the same deadly accuracy that had earned him his reputation. The Marauders scrambled, their formation breaking down as they tried to retaliate, but they were no match for him. He had the high ground, the terrain, and the element of surprise. Sarah, now! Mike shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. Sarah, freed from the grip of the energy net, had already moved into action. She had her sidearm drawn and fired, taking down two of the Marauders who had tried to flank Mike. Her shots were as accurate as his, each one finding its mark in the confusion. Mike knew they didn't have long. The Marauders would regroup, and they would come at them harder, faster. He had to get Sarah out of there, and fast. He sprinted toward her, using the chaos as cover, and grabbed her arm, pulling her behind a large boulder. We need to move, he said, his voice urgent. But Sarah's eyes were focused on something behind him. Mike turned just in time to see the Marauder leader, his face twisted in fury, picking up his weapon from the ground. Blood poured from his shoulder, but he wasn't finished yet. He charged, his eyes locked on Mike with a murderous rage. You can't escape me, sniper! He roared, his voice filled with venom. Mike's heart rate spiked, but he didn't hesitate. His rifle was already in his hands, and before the Marauder leader could take another step, Mike squeezed the trigger. The leader's body jerked violently as the bullet pierced his chest. He collapsed to the ground, his eyes wide in shock, disbelief written across his face. Mike exhaled, steadying himself. The immediate threat was over, but only for now. They weren't out of danger yet. Let's move, Hawk, Mike said, his voice calm, but with the underlying urgency of someone who knew the fight wasn't over. Sarah nodded, and together they disappeared into the dense jungle, leaving the bodies of the fallen Marauders behind them. But Mike knew the worst was yet to come. They were far from safe. The Vathra would never let them get away so easily. The trap had just begun. The jungle had fallen silent once more, but the tension in the air was palpable. Mike crouched low, Sarah beside him, both of them watching the thick underbrush, waiting for the next move. The fight had been fierce, but it wasn't over. The Marauders were still out there, regrouping, preparing for their next attack. Mike's mind raced. He had taken down the Marauder leader, but he knew they were far from safe. The Vathra had far more soldiers, far more resources, and Mike and Sarah were now deep in hostile territory, isolated and surrounded. Their position was compromised, and the Marauders knew exactly where they were. "I don't like this," Sarah muttered under her breath, her voice tight with concern. Her eyes darted between the trees, scanning the perimeter. Mike's eyes narrowed. He had no intention of giving up the high ground, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. They had a small window, a chance to escape before the Marauders could rally. But in his gut, Mike knew it wasn't going to be that simple. "Don't worry," Mike said, his voice steady, despite the pounding in his chest. "We've got the element of surprise. We just need to move quickly." Sarah nodded but didn't look convinced. "They've got numbers on us, Mike. And they know how we operate. We won't get far." Mike clenched his jaw, his thoughts racing. She was right. The Marauders were no strangers to human tactics. They'd studied him, they'd studied the white feather sniper legends, and now they had their chance to break him. But Mike had been through worse. He wasn't about to let this become his last stand. Suddenly, the soft sound of footsteps in the distance caught his attention. His body tensed. They were coming. Fast. Mike's eyes met Sarah's, and she gave him a small nod, her hand going to the sidearm at her hip. It was time. The underbrush behind them rustled, and without a word, Mike sprung into action. He dropped to one knee, his rifle raised in an instant, the crosshairs sweeping across the clearing ahead. The target was clear, a marauder, his silhouette barely visible in the shadows. The soldier was moving cautiously, unaware of the imminent threat. But Mike didn't pull the trigger. Not yet. A slow, calculating breath. He had trained for moments like this. He knew what it took to make a clean kill. Patience. Precision. Another marauder emerged from the trees, then another. Mike's heart rate began to spike, but his breathing remained steady. His fingers tightened on the trigger, ready to take the shot, but then, something changed. The marauders stopped. They didn't advance. They were waiting. And Mike realized, too late, that they had anticipated his move. "Damn it!" Mike muttered under his breath, the realization hitting him like a ton of bricks. "They've set a trap." "Ambush," Sarah whispered, her eyes flashing as she assessed the situation. "We're walking straight into it." Mike's eyes darted from one angle to the next. The trees were dense around them, but the clearing they were in had no escape routes. The marauders had lured them into a corner. "Sarah, stay close," Mike said, his voice low but filled with authority. He motioned for her to follow him as he moved quickly to the left, moving deeper into the jungle. They had to keep the pressure on the marauders, never giving them the upper hand. The moment they showed fear or hesitation, the marauders would move in for the kill. As they moved, Mike scanned their surroundings, but it was clear that the marauders were closing in. He could feel them. The weight of their presence. The crackle of their communications. The stench of their overconfidence. "It's a psychological game," Mike said, speaking quietly to Sarah as they navigated through the jungle. "They want us to break. To panic." Sarah's eyes flicked at him, studying his expression. "It's not going to work." Mike smiled slightly. "I know." The sound of footsteps grew louder. The marauders were getting closer. And then, from behind them, there was a rustle, too close, too precise to be anything but a human, or rather, something that moved with deliberate purpose. Mike and Sarah stopped, crouching low, each of them pressing themselves against the rough bark of a tree. Their hearts were pounding now, but Mike's mind was laser-focused. They had to make a stand here. "I'll take the rear," Sarah whispered, her hand tightening around her sidearm. "You move forward." Mike hesitated, his mind calculating the best move. It was clear that Sarah was eager to take on the marauders, but he had to remind her, they weren't just fighting for survival. They were trying to outsmart the Vathra. In this game, the first to give in was the first to lose. "Hold your fire until I say so," Mike ordered, his voice steady. Sarah didn't argue. She knew better than to question his judgment. The footsteps continued, circling, probing. The marauders were hunting. They knew Mike's reputation. They knew how he operated, but now they were looking for the cracks in his armor. And then, just as Mike's breath slowed to a controlled rhythm, the trap was sprung. A blast of gunfire rang out from the left, forcing Mike to drop to the ground, narrowly avoiding the deadly spray of bullets. His instincts kicked in as he rolled to the side, coming up on one knee, rifle raised. But there was no time to aim, no time to calculate. He fired blindly, hearing the thud of a body hitting the ground, but the marauders were already closing in. There were too many of them. "Sarah!" Mike shouted, his voice a mix of urgency and command. He needed her now. "I'm on it," she replied, her voice sharp with resolve. Mike adjusted his position, his eyes scanning the area for targets. He had to keep moving, had to outsmart them before they cornered them completely. He dove behind a thick stump, narrowly avoiding another barrage of fire, and then swung his rifle back into position. Through the smoke and confusion, he could just make out the figure of a marauder soldier, one of the flanking units trying to move in. Mike's rifle clicked with precision as he fired, hitting the target dead center, sending the marauder sprawling. "Keep it up, Sarah!" Mike called, his voice a low growl, his eyes tracking the next soldier in line. The pressure was mounting, but he thrived in this chaos, moving like water, flowing through the jungle with lethal intent. Seconds passed like hours. The marauders were relentless, pushing in from every direction. They had underestimated Mike's determination and his ability to adapt. Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, Mike spotted movement in the distance. A larger group of marauders, flanking from the right. He cursed under his breath. They were being surrounded. "New plan," Mike muttered. "We make a run for it. Move on my mark." Sarah's eyes met his. There was no hesitation. Just an understanding. "Mark," Mike said. They were on the move again, weaving between the trees, closing the gap between themselves and the distant ridge. The marauders, caught off guard by the sudden shift, hesitated just long enough for Mike and Sarah to break through their lines. But even as they moved, Mike knew this was far from over. The dense jungle stretched out before them like an endless labyrinth, shadows shifting and flickering as the moonlight filtered through the canopy above. Mike's breath was heavy, but his movements remained smooth, almost fluid. He had been through worse situations, many times, but there was something about tonight that felt different. The stakes were higher, the pressure relentless. Sarah was close behind him, keeping her pace steady, her eyes scanning the perimeter. They had made it this far, but they weren't out of danger yet. The marauders were relentless, hunting them down with military precision, but Mike had a plan. He always had a plan. "How much farther?" Sarah's voice broke the silence, low and careful. "Not far," Mike replied, his voice a whisper. He didn't look back, his focus remained forward. He could almost feel the marauders behind them, closing in with every step. They weren't just hunting for revenge, they were hunting to break him. The sound of the jungle was eerily quiet, and Mike's senses sharpened. The air felt heavier now, the weight of the chase pressing down on him. The marauders were smarter than he had given them credit for. They had laid traps, used every advantage, and had forced him and Sarah into a corner. But he wasn't going to let them win. Not tonight. They reached the ridge, their last piece of high ground. The jungle thinned here, offering them a temporary reprieve. Mike stopped, his fingers twitching instinctively, running through the calculations in his head. The ridge was their best shot at regrouping, but it wouldn't hold long. The marauders would be upon them soon enough. "Set up here," Mike ordered, lowering himself into a crouch beside a large boulder, his rifle resting against his knee. "We make our stand here." Sarah didn't argue. She knew this was it. They were about to face the marauders head-on. She took cover behind a tree, her sidearm ready, eyes scanning for movement. Mike checked his weapon one more time, steadying his breathing. He had been through countless battles, but this one felt different. The marauders had no idea what they were dealing with. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Mike's heartbeat echoed in his ears, but he forced himself to stay calm. Focus. Patience. That's how he had survived this long. Suddenly, the stillness shattered. A faint rustling to his left. A shadow moved across the ridge. "They're here," Mike said, his voice barely a whisper. Without hesitation, he swung his rifle into position, scanning the trees. The first marauder appeared, his silhouette barely visible against the darkened backdrop of the jungle. Mike's scope locked onto the figure, the crosshairs steady as he took a deep breath. His finger hovered over the trigger. But just before he fired, the marauder stopped, turning his head in their direction. His eyes narrowed, sensing something. Mike's grip tightened on the rifle, but he didn't pull the trigger. Not yet. They had been lured into the open. "Stay low," Mike ordered, his voice sharp. He dropped to the ground, sliding behind the rock for cover. Sarah followed suit, moving quickly and silently. They didn't have time to second-guess. The marauders were closing in. Another figure emerged from the underbrush, then another, and another. It wasn't just a handful anymore. They were surrounded. "Take the shot when you have it," Mike murmured, his eyes flicking over to Sarah. She nodded, her face set in a grim expression. She knew the stakes. She had been in enough firefights to understand what was about to happen. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for control. And Mike wasn't about to lose it now. The first shots rang out. The sound of gunfire was deafening as the marauders opened fire from multiple angles. Mike's pulse quickened, but his movements were precise. He fired first, taking down the closest soldier in one fluid motion. The marauder dropped like a ragdoll, his body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. "Covering fire!" Sarah shouted, her sidearm flashing as she took down another soldier attempting to flank them. The marauders, startled by the sudden assault, hesitated. That was all Mike needed. He moved again, fluidly shifting his position behind another rock, scanning for the next target. The marauders had regrouped, their faces twisted with frustration and anger. They had underestimated Mike, but now they were getting desperate. Desperate men made mistakes. Mike knew that better than anyone. "Keep them pinned down," Mike said, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "I've got a shot." Sarah fired again, her aim true as she took out another marauder advancing on their position. Mike adjusted his scope, narrowing in on the next target. He had them right where he wanted them, too close for comfort. They had no idea what he was capable of. The second marauder stepped into the open, his rifle raised, his finger ready to pull the trigger. But Mike was faster. He squeezed the trigger, and the marauder's body jerked backward, a red stain blooming across his chest as he crumpled to the ground. The remaining marauders hesitated for just a moment, giving Mike the opening he needed. He moved swiftly, adjusting his aim, finding the next target. The marauder leader was still in the back, barking orders, trying to control the chaos unfolding around him. But Mike's focus was sharp. He wouldn't miss. The shot rang out, and the marauder leader stumbled forward, his hand reaching for his throat. He looked up at Mike, his eyes wide with shock. The white feather sniper had taken him down without a second thought. The remaining marauders froze. There was no coming back from this. They had lost their leader, their advantage. And Mike, with his deadly precision, had sealed their fate. "Clear," Mike said, lowering his rifle as the last of the marauders either fled or lay lifeless on the ground. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes scanning the area one last time to ensure they were truly alone. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice tired but resolute. "For now," Mike replied, his eyes still on the trees around them. "But we're not out of the woods yet. We'll need to keep moving." They both knew the truth. The battle might be won, but the war wasn't over. The Vathra marauders were relentless, and they would come back for vengeance. But for tonight, Mike had done what he did best: survive. And in the quiet aftermath of the battle, he knew there was one thing he could count on: he and Sarah would keep fighting until the very end. "Let's go," Mike said, already moving forward. The jungle ahead was dark, but he had no doubt that they would find a way through it. Together. The jungle was eerily quiet in the wake of the battle. The sounds of distant gunfire, the snapping of twigs underfoot, the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, all of it felt like a distant memory now, swallowed up by the night. Mike and Sarah moved through the dense underbrush, their footsteps light but purposeful, a shared understanding between them that they weren't truly safe yet. Mike didn't look back. He kept his eyes fixed ahead, his mind already processing the events that had unfolded, searching for any signs of the Marauders regrouping. He had faced ambushes before, but the Vathra were different. They were relentless. Their leader might have fallen, but Mike knew that wouldn't stop them from coming after him, after both of them. The scent of danger was still thick in the air. "How long before we hit the extraction point?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet but laced with the weariness that came from hours of constant danger. Mike glanced at his watch. "A few clicks," he said. "We're almost there." His tone was even, but the fatigue in his eyes was unmistakable. The fight had drained him, physically, emotionally. He had seen countless battles, lost friends, survived situations that should have killed him, but this felt different. There had been something about the Marauders' tactics, their relentless pursuit of them, that left a bitter taste in his mouth. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't done. The Vathra were not just fighting for control of territory, they were fighting for something personal. "Mike!" Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts. "I know you've got your head in the game, but how many more of them are out there?" Mike didn't answer immediately. He knew what she meant. The feeling of being hunted, of never truly being able to rest. But he couldn't afford to show any sign of weakness. "Not now. I'll be damned if we let them get another shot at us," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. Sarah didn't respond immediately, but Mike could feel her eyes on him. She knew what it was like to be in the line of fire, to have death breathing down your neck, but there was something about Mike's stoic demeanor that made her uneasy. She trusted him with her life, but even she couldn't ignore the toll it had taken on him. They pressed forward, navigating the dense jungle with careful steps. The trees here were taller, their branches intertwining in a thick canopy that blocked most of the moonlight. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. Each step they took seemed to echo in the silence. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small clearing. In the distance, Mike spotted the glow of their extraction point, a faint light flickering through the trees. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It meant they were almost there. "We're close," Mike muttered. "Stay sharp." They moved toward the light, their footsteps quickening, but cautious. As they neared the clearing, Mike motioned for Sarah to halt. His instincts were on edge, and he wasn't about to let his guard down, not when they were so close to safety. Sarah noticed it too. The absence of sound. No crickets. No birds. Nothing. "Something's wrong," she whispered, eyes scanning the perimeter. Mike nodded, his body tensing. "Stay low. We're not alone." He gestured for Sarah to follow as he crouched down, moving silently through the underbrush. The extraction point was just ahead, a makeshift landing zone carved into the jungle, but there was no sign of their transport. No sign of their backup. "Where the hell is the evac team?" Sarah muttered under her breath. Her hand instinctively went to her sidearm, her fingers brushing the cold metal. She wasn't sure if it was the silence that unnerved her or the growing sense that they were being watched. "We'll find them," Mike replied, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. The feeling in his gut had only intensified. They weren't going to make it to the evac without a fight. He could feel it in his bones. Mike slowed his pace as they reached the edge of the clearing, peering out toward the dim glow. The landing zone should have been bustling with activity, but instead, it was eerily still. Not a soul in sight. Just a single, flickering light that cast long, shadowy shapes across the ground. Then, a sound broke the silence. A twig snapping. Then another. Mike's instincts kicked in, his body reacting before his mind even had a chance to process the situation. He turned, dropping low, his rifle raised. But it was too late. A figure stepped out of the shadows, too familiar to be a mere soldier. Mike's heart skipped a beat as the silhouette took shape, and the figure stepped into the pale moonlight. The same man who had been at the heart of the Marauder attack, the Marauder leader, or what was left of him. How is this possible? Mike whispered to himself. The Marauder leader's grin was twisted, bloodied, but unmistakably alive. His hand rested on a blood-stained bandage around his chest, but his eyes gleamed with hatred and a sick satisfaction. Did you think I wouldn't come for you? He hissed, his voice raw but filled with venom. Mike's grip on his rifle tightened, but he didn't fire. Not yet. His mind was reeling. Had he misjudged the situation? No. This had to be a trap. You should have stayed dead, Mike growled. You're still just a pawn. All of you. The Marauder leader's laugh was dark, almost maniacal. A pawn? He echoed. No, Lieutenant. I'm more than that. I'm your reckoning. He raised his hand, signaling to the darkness around them. In an instant, more marauders emerged from the trees, 5, 6, maybe more. They circled the clearing, weapons raised, eyes locked onto Mike and Sarah with predatory intent. Mike's mind raced as the walls closed in around them. The fight had never truly ended. It was all part of a plan, a game they hadn't even realized they were playing. And now, with no way out, the trap was complete. Get down! Mike shouted, throwing himself and Sarah behind the nearest cover, a large, jagged rock formation that offered some protection but little else. The Marauder leader stepped forward, his face contorting into a grimace. There's nowhere to run. You'll die here, like the dogs you are. Mike didn't respond. He was calculating, searching for the slightest flaw in their positioning. He could take them out, piece by piece, if given the right moment. We've been through worse, Sarah said, her voice tight, but her resolve unshaken. Mike's eyes flicked to hers, and he nodded. Let's make this count. The final confrontation had arrived. And this time, it was personal.